This is the WJW podcast, brought to you by the Washington Jewish Week and Mid-Atlantic Media. Welcome to the WJW podcast. I'm your host, Aaron Trudler, editor of the Washington Jewish Week. I'm joined today by Representative Ritchie Torres. Congressman Torres has represented his hometown of the Bronx and New York's 15th congressional district since he got to Washington and took office in 2021. Prior to that, he served in the New York City Council from 2014 to 2020. Congressman Torres is a member of the House Committee on Financial Services and a member of the House Select Committee on the strategic competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party. He has earned widespread acclaim throughout the Jewish community for his strong support of Israel. Nearly 300,000 people heard Congressman Torres speak at the March for Israel in Washington, D.C. in November, and his speeches, statements, and op-eds in support of Israel have garnered praise from throughout the Jewish community. Congressman Torres, thank you for taking the time to chat.
Good to be here.
Before we get into October 7th and its aftermath, I want to talk to you a little bit about your position regarding Israel. Long before October 7th, you have proudly and publicly been a staunch supporter of the state of Israel and a good friend of the Jewish community. And I'm wondering, how is it that a congressman from the Bronx came to take on the mantle of being one of the most steadfast champions of Israel in Congress?
Well, I would be the first to admit that I'm an accidental advocate for both the Jewish community and the Jewish state. I grew up in a community that was almost entirely African American and Latino, so I had no real engagement with the Jewish community for most of my upbringing. I had never gone to Israel in the first half of my life, and when I was first elected to the city council, I was a blank slate, and then I was invited by the Jewish Community Relations Council of New York to go on a delegation to Israel. And when I traveled there about 10 years ago, it was one of the most formative and transformative experiences of my life. Yad Vashem, the Masada. I was particularly affected by Sderot. I remember speaking to a local mayor who said that the majority of his children struggle with post-traumatic stress because families like his live under the threat of relentless rocket fire. And I remember seeing bus stops doubling as bomb shelters. And I said to myself, imagine the sheer trauma of a 5-year-old who's seeking refuge in a bomb shelter while sirens are going off, while rockets are being fired, while adults are panicking. I come from the South Bronx where people live in fear of bullets, but no one in the United States lives in fear of rockets. No one worries that Mexico and Canada are going to fire rockets into American homes and communities. And so I realized early on that Israel faces a level of insecurity and volatility that has no analog in the American experience. And before rushing to judge Israel, people should go there and see the facts on the ground with their own eyes, because it is the greatest form of education that one can receive regarding the Jewish state.
Okay. Now, since October 7th, we've seen some of the widespread support that we saw for Israel in the immediate aftermath of the attack begin to wane to a certain extent. And as time has gone on, the calls for a ceasefire have intensified, and the criticism of Israel's response to the October 7th attack have become much more prevalent. What do you say to people who believe that a ceasefire is the way to go at this point in time, and that Israel has become the aggressor, and that they should stop basically its efforts to eliminate Hamas?
First, we have to recognize that a permanent ceasefire is a fiction. It's one of the greatest fictions of our time. Hamas has said that it will never abide by a permanent ceasefire, that it's committed to repeating October 7th. And so we should disabuse ourselves of the notion that there is such a thing as a permanent ceasefire. And when people tell me, I'm in favor of a ceasefire, I simply reply, well, what kind of ceasefire? right? Do you support a ceasefire that would keep the hostages in captivity and Hamas in power? Or do you support a ceasefire in which Hamas releases the hostages and surrenders unconditionally? And I support the release of the hostages and the unconditional surrender of Hamas. And if you are a supporter of peace between Israelis and Palestinians, then you should support the removal of Hamas from power. The removal of Hamas from power may not be as sufficient, but it is a necessary condition for a sustainable peace between Israelis and Palestinians. If Hamas remains in power, there will never be peace. There will only be an endless cycle of violence and war. A wise person once said, if you do the same thing over and over again and expect a different result, that's the definition of insanity. The only way forward is the removal of Hamas from power.
In addition to your strong support of Israel, as I noted earlier, you've been a very good friend to the Jewish community, and you've been very, very outspoken about the need to combat anti-Semitism, which has increased at a frightening pace in recent years, and which has seemingly spiraled out of control since October 7th. Why do you think the Jewish community has a proverbial target on its back? And what could be done by our elected officials, community leaders, and others to combat the hate and bigotry that is directed at the Jewish community?
Well, history is destiny, and there's a long and ugly history of discrimination and persecution against Jews. And I see anti-Zionism as simply the latest mutation in the ancient DNA of anti-Semitism. I am alarmed by what is unfolding on college campuses and on social media platforms. The Economist had a poll which found that a quarter of young Americans downplay or deny the Holocaust. There was a Harvard-Harris poll which found that half of young Americans side with Hamas in the present conflict. And there are growing numbers of Americans who have been indoctrinated with a hatred for Israel that is so visceral and so fanatical that it renders them indifferent to the value of Jewish life. And I point the finger squarely at social media platforms and higher education. And I'll bring up one issue in particular, TikTok. TikTok is in a class of its own as an amplifier of anti-Semitism and as a national security risk. And TikTok is not simply a social media platform, it is the leading news source for the next generation of Americans, for Generation Z and the Alpha generation. And the fact that we have put the leading news source for the most malleable minds in our society in the hands of our leading foreign adversary, the Chinese Communist Party, is an act of self-sabotage. It is the equivalent of putting ABC, CBS, and NBC in the hands of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And so as a matter of national security, we as a country have no choice but to pass legislation that forces a sale of TikTok because the status quo is unsustainable. I never thought in my wildest nightmares that Osama bin Laden's letter to America would be trending on TikTok. And if that is not enough of a provocation to effectuate a forced sale of TikTok, then I'm not sure what would be. So we have to strike while the iron's hot.
You mentioned TikTok, and that's obviously unique because of its ties to China, as you mentioned. What are your thoughts in terms of some of the other social media platforms that I know have been before Congress at different hearings in different ways? There's a strong sense among many that a lot of the hate that's being promulgated, not just against the Jewish community in the form of anti-Semitism, but other communities as well, is being spread and exacerbated by some of the more mainstream social media platforms. I'm just curious what your thoughts are in regard to those entities.
There's nothing unprecedented about anti-Semitism. What is unprecedented is the algorithmic amplification of anti-Semitism on all social media platforms, not only TikTok, but X and Instagram and all the rest. There is no simple solution. When you're debating the topic of social media, what often comes to mind is Section 230. And there is no agreement in Congress on how to move forward with Section 230 reform. Um, there are conflicting views about content matter. I'm in favor of moderating content for the purpose of filtering out anti-Semitism, but there are others who feel that content moderation is simply a euphemism for censorship. And so those are issues that are actually before the Supreme Court as we speak. And there's no clarity about how to move forward, how to proceed with a reform of Section 230. It's one of the hardest issues in Congress.
I think over time that'll have to play itself out just because the situation keeps getting exacerbated. And I definitely know there are no easy answers there. As an elected official who's somewhat on the younger side, let's call it, you often seem to be one of the lone voices in Israel in Congress that talks about strong support of Israel. Now, particularly in the Democratic Party from the left, we're hearing a lot of voices emanating that take an opposite view, and they seem to be somewhat critical of the state of Israel. Why do you think some of your younger Democratic colleagues from the left in Congress are espousing anti-Israel views? And should the Jewish community be worried about the younger generation harboring these sort of views?
I worry that young Americans have been ideologically captured by social media platforms and college campuses. The greatest predictor of one's attitudes toward Israel is not race; it's age, and to a lesser extent, it's educational attainment. I find younger, more college-educated people tend to be much more skeptical, much more critical, and much more outright hostile toward Israel, and have adopted a narrative that portrays Israel as the oppressor and Hamas as the oppressed. And I would simply tell those young people, first, the narrative is wrong because Hamas is the single greatest oppressor of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and has been so for more than a decade. But before you rush to judge Israel, I would tell them, go to Israel. Speak to both Israelis and Palestinians. Speak to both Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews. Go to a place like Sderot and meet with the families who live under the threat of rocket fire. And I guarantee you that you will adopt a view of Israel that is far more nuanced than the caricature that percolates on social media. The problem is that we have a generation of Americans whose views on Israel is formed not by a serious study of history, but by TikTok, by ideological narratives that are distortions of the truth.
Yeah, you mentioned, I mean, I think your focus on education, Congressman, is something that I think is lacking amongst many people in the younger generation, as you referenced. I think that people, whether it be on TikTok and other venues or other social media platforms, are spreading propaganda that they're hearing from others without having that knowledge base to know whether or not it's in fact accurate, and without having, like you said, the ability to form those nuanced views from having experienced it firsthand. So I think whether it be in higher education or other educational settings, our schools, our communities definitely need to do a better job to try and get the message out about enhanced education about Israel, not to formulate people's views, but to give them the tools that they theoretically need to make their own informed decisions, as opposed to now where they're kind of getting bombarded with information, a lot of which is inaccurate or taken out of context and leads to just visceral hatred being spread like wildfire on these social media platforms. Question for you, one more question actually. With calls for U.S. Military and other kinds of financial assistance to Israel to become conditional on different factors, which is becoming more and more common now. We're hearing it from different lawmakers, from different organizations, different groups. What's your sense of the current state of the U.S.-Israel relationship, which has historically been very strong, but in light of some of these differing voices and critical voices of Israel, some people perceive it to be on shaky ground. I'm curious what your assessment is of the current bond and where it stands.
I'm of the view that the security of Israel depends heavily on the U.S.-Israel relationship. And the U.S.-Israel relationship depends heavily on public opinion. And it would be disingenuous to deny that public opinion has been increasingly shifting against Israel. So it is cause for concern. I think as of today, the U.S.-Israel relationship remains fundamentally strong, but we should not take its strength for granted. I mean, those of us who care about the relationship have to fight to sustain it for the next generation, because there are larger forces like higher education, like social media, that are conspiring against us. And, there's a sense in which October 7th has been an awakening for the Jewish community. I have seen a heightened sense of activism and awareness in the Jewish community. And so I hope we can harness the power of that activism to sustain the U.S.-Israel relationship for the long run in the face of serious challenges here at home.
Congressman Torres, thank you so much for taking the time to chat.
Absolutely. Take care.
Thank you, Congressman.